So I've actually noticed that a lot of distance runners and very good distance runners, like obviously in the athletics community, you've got people who are marathon runners and represent the country. They often don't have very good health when they get older. And that to me was always a strange finding. They often have heart disease or they have, they put on a lot of weight. And some of that obviously may be dietary, because they get used to eating a certain diet or whatever it is. But it never made sense to me that the amount of aerobic training they did wasn't protective in the long term until I read this when I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense because the stimulus that they're getting is probably so much metabolic dysfunction over time that their system has actually, been depleted in its capability of dealing with some of those stresses.
And the other thing I think of too is people always associate marathon runners as being healthy because they've got low fat mass, which typically they do. But they also have low muscle mass. And if we look at one of the key
markers of health for long term,
lifestyle factors for health, whether it's just like all-cause mortality, chronic diseases, it's the amount of muscle mass you have. It goes back to the point I made before of distance running or doing aerobic training is catabolic in nature.
It eats up muscle tissue.
Well, and again, it makes a lot of sense because you actually have a particular ratio you need to maintain of vascularization relative to the amount of myofibers you have. That's why doing distance running doesn't cause hypertrophy. It will typically reduce the amount of muscle mass so you can actually increase the capillary density and therefore maximize oxygen delivery to the muscle.
From the standpoint of utilizing resistance training, what's it going to do, you think, at a metabolic level in terms of maintaining the ability to manage oxidative stress?
Well, I actually wonder how much of it has to do with building up sensitivity of the system.
Yep.
I kind of look at it similar to, say, like insulin resistance, using that as an example where if you're someone who is constantly eating hypercaloric diet and typically a poor diet, you're flooding your system with insulin all the time and you actually build up resistance. And this is the hallmark for developing things like type 2 diabetes, but metabolic syndrome, which is associated with essentially all chronic disease. And I wonder if the issue has to do with lack of diversity of how you stress the metabolic system, where you're just applying the same type of stressor, which, for the untrained person's okay.
It's good for them.
It's going to be really beneficial.
They're not being exposed to it day in, day out, twice a day sort of thing.
But for the elite athlete who's been distance running for 20, 30 years, not only have you capped out the ability to enhance that system or...
you're close to your limit.
Close to the limit. You've also essentially lost robustness, so to speak, or...
with how it deals with that overall stress.
Correct, particularly if you have not applying any other type of stresses like resistance training. And so, it probably just reinforces the benefit of resistance training for distance runners too, of thinking about how it potentially enhances metabolic function. I'm not sure if anything's been looked into that, but...
Yeah, well, the thing that I often think about too is, the hormonal effect and the benefits that you potentially get in distance runners, because obviously one of the major, and it's particularly apparent in female athletes, but one of the big problems you have is obviously, previously it was called, the female athlete triad, and now it's probably more considered, REDS is the term that gets used. But I often think that that's, in my mind at least, and obviously, people are much more versed in this than I am, but it's clearly, causes a significant amount of hormonal disruption. And one of the things that I think is very clear is that a high volume of training and a lot of aerobic training tends to disrupt that much more than resistance training. Unless the volume of resistance training is similarly high, like it could be with a distance runner. So I think one of the things that I always think about is how much benefit hormonally it may give to, a female distance runner for them being able to maintain, say, something like a healthy menstruation, because they're actually not in this state where their hormonal system is depleted because of the volume of distance running